So what did consumer engagement in my PhD look like? So I've already spoken about the theoretical framework that helped provide the structure around how it was that I could evaluate the consumer engagement. But just to reiterate on the context, I'm a clinician. I'm working as a physiotherapist in spinal cord injury for a long time. I had an independent PhD project in that I had a scholarship where I could pursue my own topic, which was media portrayal of spinal cord injury. This was a government-funded scholarship, full-time. I had 2 supervisors, one of whom had experience in spinal cord injury. I think it's really important to acknowledge these contexts because everyone's going to be very different, and what you bring in as a researcher can be different as well. There's no right or wrong to it, but I think it really provides a nice backdrop to how it is that you might approach consumer engagement. From the outset, I was encouraged to put in an ethics application for consumer engagement. And at the time, I was a bit like, I think anyone, if we can try and avoid an ethics application, we will. But again, in hindsight, I realised it was a good process to go through. Not only that, it meant that I had to go through existing literature and create a good reason to bring in the consumer group together. But it also means that I can report it in this way. Had I not gone through ethics, I wouldn't have been able to do presentations or do a formal evaluation to help translate the knowledge that I've learned. So definitely it was good to put in the ethics. But I started ethics right at the very start of the PhD. There were no hiccups in having it submitted and passed. But the time that it took from starting through to advertising for group members, recruiting, and then to the first meeting, it was 6 months. So if you think that a PhD goes for 3.5 years, 6 months of that was, I couldn't start that consumer engagement until then. So I think that's something to consider. When I advertised for the position, I thought 10 people would be great, and I'm so glad I didn't have 10 in the end because that would have been too many. But I actually had only received interest from 4 people, which was totally fine. I thought that if I had more than 10 people interested, I might pick based on maybe some of the experiences that would shape people's experience with spinal cord injury, but their perception of media maybe as well. So I did ask on the expression of interest if they had a complete or an incomplete injury, if it was non-traumatic or traumatic, if they sustained their injury at a young age or an old age, if they were male or female. In the end, I didn't have to do any selection based on that criteria, but it was really good to understand that kind of that makeup of the group as we went through. So I initially had 4, but then I recruited an extra 3 people in the second year, which was great. I initially accounted for up to 5 meetings, but in the end, we just had the 3 formal meetings throughout the duration of the thesis. I lined these up with either beforehand in trying to sort out the study design, or I had a meeting afterwards where I was going through the data analysis phase for feedback. But there was actually a lot more informal and email exchanges and phone calls in between, which actually proved to be very valuable. Since commencing, I know the SRI, I've done a lot of work on providing a remuneration guideline, but at the time I found some information through Safer Care Victoria and Victoria Government, and fortunately I was able to tap into some funds to provide some remuneration, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. And then my approach was to do a reflective data analysis. So I had minutes from all our meetings, I kept all our email exchanges, and I kept a diary along the way. And all of that information together helped me to do an analysis using the framework of the research cycle, the levels of participation, and the guiding principles. At the very end, I also put together a survey for group members so they could offer me some of their insights as well. And so this is what I came up with. Consumers engage at each stage of the research cycle. But I must acknowledge the research question was actually consumer engagement that I had prior to commencing the PhD. I think I was in a fortunate position that as a physio, it was over the years, I realised that the portrayal of media, of spinal cord injury in the media was an issue. And as I was putting my application together for the scholarship, I was actually be able to put my research proposal. I sent it through to the Birdwood Academy at that time. I think they still do have a consultation panel of people with spinal cord injury that could advise on research, and that was really helpful because even though I knew that it had consumer backing, it was good to have that formal support to form part of my application. But otherwise, through the PhD proper, the consumer group, they participated at each level of the cycle. And when I also look back, I noticed that engagement or level of participation was at consultation, involving and collaborative levels. Going back to that IAP2, acknowledging all the different levels of participation, those three were kind of the ones that sat in the middle. And I also look back to see whether I adhered to the guiding principles. And I felt a little bit weird about doing this because you would kind of think, well, you know about the principles beforehand and then you make sure you adhere to them. But I guess it's just the nature of the way that I work and making sure that I'm really appreciating the lived experience and the input that the consumers provided. I personally felt that I'd kept to the guiding principles, but I knew that wasn't going to be enough and that it really needed to come from the consumers that were involved, that they felt that the guiding principles were met. So I was able to capture that information in the survey that I did at the end. And thankfully, it was a relief that they too found that the engagement was meaningful. So that was, a relief that they felt the same way. There were three key impacts that happened, and I won't go into too much detail because of time, but as I mentioned before, majority of my PhD was spent in lockdown here in Melbourne, and I guess that shifted a little bit how I thought I would be engaging with consumers. Initially, I counted for having face-to-face meetings, but that we ultimately then went online, and in fact that might have been a better thing, making it easier for people to be able to attend the meetings. But I guess something that wasn't anticipated was actually having that engagement with consumers when I'm working pretty much in isolation at home, not being able to come onto campus and engage with other students. I was still working as a physio, not being able to go into work and talk about my studies. I really felt that having that opportunity to have those informal email exchanges, phone calls, was really supportive for me as I went through the PhD, and that was something that was very, very valuable and certainly not anticipated. For the second study, so I haven't described for my PhD, I did a content analysis of an Australian newspaper. The second study was a phenomenological study interviewing people with spinal cord injury about their perceptions of media portrayals of spinal cord injury and the impact. And then the third study was interviewing journalists and sources to find out how stories are created. And it was for that third study that we had a really in-depth discussion, I guess, around who would be the research participants for that study, acknowledging that people with spinal cord injury could be a direct source to journalists, but in fact the individual experience of spinal cord injury of that person could be varied, and that wouldn't necessarily give us, because we were wanting a more of an understanding around systems of practices and processes around how stories are developed, and so that helped us decide that they would be excluded from that study as a source. So that was really key to that study. And then the third key impact was when it came to dissemination activities, and having members of the group involved in putting together infographics, being invited to write a story for a local peer group newsletter, and also having a couple of members participate in a presentation for a conference. And so that really added extra depth to the experience. So when I think about what were the enablers and challenges, definitely enabler was a shared interest in the research topic, the ability to build rapport, and that was probably enhanced by the fact that I did know many of the members beforehand, but I felt very comfortable in working alongside people with spinal cord injury. COVID again, because moving onto a virtual platform helped with the dissemination of research findings, which I think wouldn't have happened otherwise. The supervisory support was paramount. If it wasn't for my supervisors being supportive of this and offering advice, none of this would have been possible. And as I mentioned before, having access to some funds. So as a higher degree research student here at La Trobe, there's a small bucket of money that I can access to help with my research. And if I didn't have that, then I wouldn't have been able to offer the remuneration, which would have made me feel a bit uncomfortable. So there was definitely some challenges along the way, for sure. Probably the first one was the complexity in varied perspectives. I was probably very naive to think that, you have a group of people with spinal cord injury and they're all going to be on the same page. That definitely wasn't the case, which is a good thing. It was interesting because it ran very close parallel to my research, where media will make an assumption that everyone's the same, and in fact media doesn't acknowledge the diversity of experiences that might sit within not only people with spinal cord injury but also disability more broadly. So the same goes for a consumer group, and so it's kind of figuring out how you can collate those experiences or perceptions when they're also very different. Time. Again, you've got a fixed period of time in a PhD. It's a challenge to try to adhere to that. I think the virtual platform, as I've said, it may have helped facilitate meetings because it meant that people didn't have to travel. But I also think it meant that sometimes things could be misconstrued or misunderstood. Like we're all been there now in virtual meetings and Zoom meetings, and sometimes you just lose some of those interpersonal communication that helps to foster relationships. So I think that was probably a little bit of a challenge. And I was also mindful that whilst we all had a shared interest in the research topic, which was media portrayal of spinal cord injury, it was very much swayed to the negative, where we weren't liking how media portrayed spinal cord injury. So that was just something I had to be mindful of as a potential bias on how the conversations evolved. So there were some pros and cons in how the group came together. As I said, it took 6 months before we could have our first meeting, and I really would have loved to have consumers engage on the content analysis that I did for the newspaper article, which is what I did whilst waiting before we had that first consumer meeting. And so I know at some organisations they provide consumers for you, where consumers are trained up to be professional engagers in research. Whilst I think there are some benefits for that, I think the cons is that you may not necessarily have people who have an interest in the topic, and to me that was what was really key. In regards to the funding, as I said, I had a bucket of money that I can use towards my research, but that's also unallocated funds for any travel if I were to present at conferences, any resources that I might need for my research. Fortunately, again, because of COVID, I wasn't traveling anywhere, so I actually had a lot of funds that I could put towards consumer engagement. But it is a reality that decisions have to be made around what's the priority, which might be challenging for some people. The third one to me was probably one of the big ones that I didn't anticipate, that opportunity to take my clinician hat off and actually have a really great chat to people with spinal cord injury without me then having to go, oh gosh, now I need to look at their wheelchair, or now I need to talk about their shoulders, which is normally the case as a clinician. Like, you can have a good chat, but at the end of the day, it's all about a clinical exchange. But to take that away, I really had I saw lived experience differently, and that was very valuable, and offered a new perspective of what it means to live with spinal cord injury. And really building the relationships and being flexible and open to opportunities, that's what really helped to extend research findings as things came to hand. So being able to collaborate in doing the conference presentation together was great. Being invited to write a story for a newsletter. These are kind of the things that you don't anticipate, but seizing the opportunities when they arise. Time for me to have a drink and we can have a chat again.
Awesome. Just while you're grabbing a drink. So yeah, feel free. We've had some questions that we'll address at the end, but for those out there, just continue to put some questions in the chat, and Leanne and I will seek to address them towards the end. But on that, in recruiting, so you mentioned the recruitment of consumers. What were the key attributes that you were looking for in consumers?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I thought I'd wanted to capture some diversity that would have shaped people's perceptions of media and spinal cord injury. So non-traumatic versus traumatic injury. And when I say incomplete or complete, a wheelchair user or a person who might be a wheelchair user and walk, or certainly because what we know is that media, automatically people think of spinal cord injury as the inability to walk and use a wheelchair. But I was really interested to know what the perspective might be from someone who walks a bit or walks full time, gender. So a few factors, but at the end, I didn't have that many people apply. But I think it was acknowledging those different, the context of where people came from, what they brought to the group. But ultimately, it was having that shared interest in the topic. And I can't imagine running the group any different. And then you wonder why people would engage if they weren't interested in the topic. But I guess people's motives might be different. So that to me was the key.
This may have a little bit to do with one of the questions that we'll address at the end in the chat, but in what areas did consultation and collaboration with consumers influence your work? And we can address the question in the chat later, but I'll get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so consultation, some examples was how coming up with the interview schedules for both of those, for the second and the third study. So the second study was interviewing people with spinal cord injury to find out what their perceptions were and then what the impact was. So the consumer group had a lot of input in designing those questions, and then they were available to do some test runs on the interviews as well. So that was really good. And then for the collaborative, when it came to a lot of the dissemination activity. So with the conference that ended up being virtual last year, it was the pre-conference workshop, there are two consumers who offered to be part of that, and we structured it in a way that it was a bit of like a Q&A to present the material. And definitely feedback on that was that it was an engaging presentation, because I think at any opportunity we can hear lived experience rather than just hearing from the researcher harping on. It makes it for a more engaging experience.
You mentioned that a complexity in varied experience was a challenge. Could you elaborate on that perhaps?
Yeah, I think I probably lacked a lot of confidence in the early stage, because I probably thought that you had to be able to really put everything into a nice, neat bundle, and then that's how it would shape or inform your research. And I kind of recognised that it was a little bit all over the place, and I thought it was, in some ways, I thought it was my fault because I wasn't able to streamline the conversation maybe around the topics that we discussed. But when I look back, I realised, actually, there's just lots of different perspectives going on here. And as I was then more confident with what was happening, I realized that was just a challenge, but not in a bad way. Because in fact, what's the point of having in consumer engagement if everyone in the group is saying the same? I mean, it'd be convenient, but it's probably not realistic. And I think that the more diverse your perspectives, the better your research can be. So, yeah, I wouldn't change it at all. But I just probably, if I start again, I'd feel more confident with it.
And that probably goes into what you were saying before about the evolution of the process, and hindsight's been a wonderful thing in that as well. The one point there as well, you mentioned implication for funds. Could you also elaborate on that?
Yeah, I don't know how it works at other universities, but as I said, here at La Trobe, as a higher degree research student, I have some funds that I can put towards my research. And I didn't have to make a decision. Like, I knew that I wanted to be able to offer the remuneration to consumers. So I used some of those funds to do that. But maybe other institutions don't offer that money. And unless it's been budgeted for in a bigger grant, it must be difficult for some students to be able to find those funds. So I think it's an important thing for all researchers and institutions to think about, because it's just not in spinal cord injury that we advocate for consumer engagement. It's across the board, and I think there needs to be models that enable that to happen, certainly as early researchers who may not have big grants to be able to budget for it.